Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV. I'm not actually fishing today, so it's going to be difficult for me, but I'm with my great friend and brand ambassador, Steve Whitfield. And today we're fishing up in Yorkshire at a beautiful venue called Ulley Reservoir. And Steve's fresh back from a fantastic performance at the Feeder Masters final on Bough Beach, where Steve came second. And the aim of the video today is to understand about the tactics that he used to great success at Bough Beach and relate them to other similar venues like Ulley. So Steve, feeder fishing's really taken off, hasn't it, over in the UK in the last 5 years? And there's a lot of feeder only matches now. And I know that's an element of the sport that you really like. And this is a venue that you fish fairly often, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I fish Ulley a lot through winter, and there's a lot of similarities with Bough Beach. Basically, it's a very deep venue, similar to Bough Beach. The main quaddy you're fishing for is bream and skimmers, but there's lots of other fish to catch. There's lots of perch, lots of roach, small skimmers. So it's got a lot of similarities to Bough Beach, and the tackle I'm using today is very similar to what I'd use at Bough Beach.
So what sort of depths were you faced with at Bough Beach, and what you're talking about here? What sort of depth you're fishing?
Well, again, depending on where you drew, but there's not too many areas in Bough Beach what were shallow, you'd say shallow. Very few pegs. For example, on the dam wall, when you're fishing 60 metres, the middle of the dam wall, you could be fishing up to in depths of water up to 40 foot deep.
Wow.
Just same as you are here at Ulley.
Yeah.
That lends itself to fishing in quite a style which is unique to a lot of other places because of the depth.
Well, I think it's really interesting. You've been fishing for what, just about 15 minutes, so we've watched your bait up, and I just think it's fascinating to learn more about this style of fishing and watch you in action. So I think that's the first thing we'll talk about is the lines that you've selected and how you fed them. So the first thing that's quite interesting is the number of rods you've set up, Steve. You've set 4 rods up. And obviously I understand that that's you've got a rod for feeding predominantly, and then you've got different rods for fishing at different lines.
Yes.
Different distances. So just tell us about your thinking today about which lines you've selected, and perhaps we can relate that to Bough Beach as well.
The line I'm going to fish primarily is 60 metres, and that's the line what I'm expecting to catch some bream on, maybe some skimmers as well. I've got 2 rods set up for that. I've got the number 2, that's the rod I'm fishing with. I've got the number 3.
Yeah.
That's the rod I've actually fed with.
Yeah.
But it's clipped up at the same distance. I've put these 2 rods on the measuring sticks at 60 metres. And the great thing about having the 2 rods set up, and especially the number 3 with it having a bit more power, I can use a bigger feeder for feeding.
Yeah. To
get more bait in. But I can also, if the conditions deteriorate and I have to put a bigger feeder on to maintain accuracy, etc., I can just pick that rod up. So I've decided to fish this one today. The conditions are pretty fine for fishing 60 metres with the number 2.
Yeah.
So the other rod I've got set up is I've got a number 2 12 foot as well. That were to fish a line around 40 metres, and I've also got the new number 1 at 11 foot. I didn't really have to put that one into play at Bough Beach because I never really had to fish really short, but especially on the dam walling areas, there were anglers had to fish for roach, fishing what you call a long pole line, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And the likes of Steve Ringer, for example, caught £16 doing that on the first day. So it weren't something I had to do because I caught skimmers and some small bream, if you like, fishing at range. Mm. Well,
I mean, one comment is obviously feeder fishing has evolved and become much more specialised, hasn't it? So what you're actually doing is you're covering your options, aren't you? So when you're match fishing or pleasure fishing, you're giving yourself a chance of perhaps having a line that you're catching some better fish on, or like a banker line perhaps, and then you've got some other lines where you're looking to catch some different species of fish like roach or smaller fish.
Yeah, I think so, because in matches where any method goes, the generalisation is to fish maybe a pole line and a feeder line.
Yeah.
But under feeder masters rules, obviously, where you've got to fish a feeder, to exploit that short line, you've got to fish it accordingly, and there's no place for the 13-foot rod for fishing at 16-18 metres. Yeah. So the 4 rods what I've got today covers me for 90% of the feeder fishing I'll ever do, especially on reservoirs and lakes, even ponds, etc.
Yeah. So we're well covered on that. And what about you're thinking about where you fed the lines? Because I noticed you fished your 60-metre line straight out in front of you, and then your 40-metre line you've gone to the left. So you're exploiting a different part of your peg as well as a different distance.
The peg I'm fishing today is generally deeper to the left, and the 40-metre line I'm fishing there, just by experience, I'm fishing in the same depth of water as I am at the 60-metre line. The only thing I'm doing is just giving myself another line to fish, completely different to where I'm fishing. Ground bait choice today, I'm fishing fish meal on the long line for bream, and I've put a cereal mix in at 40 metres for roach.
Okay.
Most venues of this size and nature, the breams tend to sit longer. There's no hard and fast rules. There's nothing telling me that I can't catch a bream at 40 metres fishing a cereal mix, but generally you'd expect to catch bream at distance and maybe roach and small skimmers shorter. Yeah. So I'm just giving myself an option to catch some fish from a different area. Yeah, and maybe top up if I need to. If I think I need to refeed long and give it a rest, I can always drop back onto this. If you didn't have the 2 or 3 lines going, you can't do this.
It's a great strategy, and the clever thing is, I guess, if you find one mix is working better than the other, you can change between the two. And I suppose also, if you want to be targeting smaller fish, you don't want to be fishing as far out, do you? You want to be catching them as quick as you can.
No, the thing about it, feeder fishing, same as any fishing, you've got to be efficient. And bringing small fish in from 60 metres isn't very efficient. Catching small fish at 16, 18 metres, you can build a massive weight together. There's very few feeder matches now, feeder-only matches, where there'll not be multiple lines set up, and that's just to exploit every bit of water in front of you.
Totally understand. Right, I'm going to be quiet now and let you fish, because I know you want to cast out again, and we'll just give you a bit more time just to hopefully get the fish going.
Right, well.
So we talked about where you fed and why. I want to now talk about what you fed. And it's absolutely fascinating looking at your side tray here with all the different baits going on. So perhaps we'll just talk about your main line, the 60-metre line, and you fed that with fish meal, yeah?
Yeah, I've used the fish meal ground bait for the 60-metre line. As I said, the longer line is I'm trying to catch bigger fish. Fish meal generally, you're catching bream, skimmers. You will catch the odd other fish with it, like you do on all ground baits, but primarily that line is to catch me bigger fish.
Well, I think we'll do a section where we actually talk about the ground bait and everything in a bit more detail. But I love the way you've got everything organised. You've got your chop worm in that there. And I noticed when you were feeding to start with, you were putting in a good amount of dead red maggots, some chop worm and some casters. And obviously, just to make sure, you know, for people that perhaps don't do a lot of feeder fishing, you didn't have a hook length on, did you? You just had a feeder, and that's your sort of technique for feeding the swim to start with.
Yeah, what I've done to start with is I've got the number 3 rod clips up there. If you can see there, I've got quite a big feeder. Yeah. It's not a huge feeder by any any standards these days, but it's quite a big feeder. Put several of them in, you can put quite a lot of bait in.
Just to be, to be a bit stupid, why are you using a cage feeder as opposed to a plastic feeder or a feeder that's got small holes in?
Wherever I can fish, I prefer cage feeders, just in general.
Yeah.
But obviously, it's all exposed because of the fine wire on the cage. You don't have to leave it in too long. Give it a good shake, and you leave it in your peg.
And just another note that I sort of would like to mention, I know that you've got some bigger feeders that you use for baiting up in certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So you can see the difference in size there. You're obviously going to be introducing a lot more bait quicker with a big feeder. Why did you sort of do 10 casts with a small feeder as opposed to 2 or 3 with a big feeder?
Well, especially on deep waters like Ulley and Bough Beach, as another example, I don't think the fish don't live at the bottom. When you're fishing waters where it's 35, 40 foot deep, the fish are sat in mid-water where they're happy. I would much prefer to put 10 or 12 feederfuls in that size and try and draw them fish down.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I think that's that's something that's really intrigued me straight away when I saw you doing it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great lesson for a lot of people to sort of benefit from. So it would perhaps feel more inefficient in that it's taking longer to feed, but you're actually doing a greater job at attracting the fish and getting them down on the bottom.
Trying to draw them fish down, follow that feeder down and try and draw them down to your peg. Same as when I'm fishing, I like to be busy. I like to keep that feeder going through the water column, dragging them fish down.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, because a lot of the time feeder fishing isn't a lazy method, is it?
No, definitely not. It's long gone are the days where you catapult 20 balls of ground bait in and then sit on it and have half an hour chucks. It's not like that at all now. There's similarities to feeder fishing now, like there is with float fishing.
Yeah.
Keeping busy, keeping that bait going in, and keeping the peg active.
Brilliant, Steve. Well, you've had a few roach, a few perch, and the last fish you had was the first skimmer, wasn't it?
Yes.
I don't know, about 6 or 8 ounces.
Yes.
So that's a good sign.
Yes.
So right, I'm going to leave you in peace again.
Right, well.
Well, Steve, you had a couple more roach, and this looks like, is it another roach or a perch coming in now?
I think it's a tiny skimmer, James.
But one thing to notice, you're really lifting the rod up, even standing up sometimes when you're playing the fish. And I guess that's to get it up over that ledge, is it?
Yeah, it's the contours of this reservoir are that there's a shallow shelf, and then it goes over the deep ledge into the deep water. Yeah. So I'm just giving myself a chance to get the fish over that ledge.
You wouldn't want to get your feeder caught on it as you're bringing the fish
No,
up.
definitely not.
So another thing that I've noticed that I think's worth mentioning, you've got braid on all your rods, yeah? You've not got any mono at all. And obviously for the sort of beginner to feeder fishing, braids is a great advantage, isn't it? You know, it's so accurate. The thin diameter means you can cast long distances very easily and accurately. But one thing that I'm quite keen to understand about is the fact that you've not used a mono shot leader. A lot of people, myself included, will use a length of shot leader which is mono. The thinking being, obviously it helps when you're casting if you're putting a lot of force into the cast, but also it incorporates a bit of stretch into the rig. But you haven't done that, Steve, so if you wouldn't mind, if you could just explain why you haven't.
Well, all the things you said are quite right, and the general trend is to have a couple of lengths of the rod of mono. The advantage with braid is that there's no stretch in it, where you've still got that little bit of stretch. Even with a mono shock leader, you do lose a little bit of contact. But I much prefer using braid, especially on this setup, and using these rods. The soft rods allow me to use braid direct as well. I have got a braid shock leader incorporated with my braid. I know that sounds a bit, see the bites there, look. That sounds a bit odd, but what I've got O10 braid on my reel, and I've got O12 braid shock leader. Now the shock leader just virtually runs 4 foot from my rod, from my rod tip down to where you'd cast the feeder.
Yeah.
And just the knots goes once round the reel.
So you're thinking with that is you've got a heavier section of braid just for the punishment of fishing and constantly casting, but you're not wasting your main braid by cutting that off every time you're fishing.
There's no doubt that braid's more robust than monofilament line, and I can fish with a braid shock leader for several weeks before I have to change it. The great thing about doing that, James, is that the reel line becomes almost unused, if you like, but the braid shock leader's taking all any wear, any ledges, and having that O12 just gives me that little bit more than I would on the.
Got you. It's a great tip, and I think it's worth mentioning as well, in my experience, that the longer you use braid for, it actually performs better.
The better it gets, exactly.
So what you're doing is you're maintaining that by not using it up. You're just constantly replacing it with a shock leader, and you're benefiting from the fact that you're using a well-worn braid as your main line. The
braid what's been on these reels, some of these reels have been on 4 and 5 years, and it's absolutely fantastic now.
It's not that you're tight, it's just it actually performs better.
Well, I don't know about that. But just having that, it also gives you the break point as well. Wherever you put whether it be mono or braid, it just gives you that point where if you were to get snagged up, you would, let's make this cast. If you do get snagged up and you have to pull for the break, it will always break on your knot, because that's the weakest part of your setup.
Well, I think it's a great tip, and next time I go feeder fishing, I'm going to try it out. I think it is worth mentioning that you couldn't probably do that with a stiff rod.
No.
You need a rod with that through progressive action.
Definitely.
To enable you to be able to fish braid straight through.
Yeah. The number 2 is absolutely perfect. It's a perfect bream rod.
Yeah.
It's a perfect bream rod. It's a perfect bream rod in the sense for using braid, especially because this rod will absorb the lunges of the big bream, etc. But I can still maintain that direct approach where I'm in contact with the fish all the time. It's
great to watch, and I find it fantastic how you see that little bite there, and that's a bed of fish. You were constantly tightening up as the braid was sinking and settling, weren't you?
Yeah,
and then that bite was so positive, you know, there was no way you were going to miss that. And that looks like a bream, doesn't it, Steve?
Yeah, this feels like a bream, James.
Nice one.
I'm gonna give it some, because there is quite a pronounced ledge out there, and I want to get this fish up in the water.
Helps that you're about 7 foot tall as well, doesn't it?
Well, yeah. It does feel like a nice fish. And you'll be able to see there, I'm direct to the fish and I'm actually in control of this.
It's great because you can see the rod bending beautifully.
Yeah.
It's not locking up, is it?
No,
it's
not at all. Nice bream there.
Brilliant. First one of the day. Well done, Steve.
Yeah. To be fair, that is a small bream for Ulley standard, but we'll take what we can get.
I think that's a brilliant fish. Well, I think that just proves the point about how efficient using braid is and matching it with a great rod like the 13-foot number 2.
Yeah, it's absolutely perfect.
And you didn't hang about getting that bream in, Steve?
No, I tend not to. I am quite aggressive when I have a fish on. I like to get it in the net pretty quick. I don't do this on purpose, it's just the way I fish, to be fair. I think if a fish is going to come off, it's going to come off regardless.
Yeah. I think it's just fantastic to watch how efficient you are, how accurate you are at casting, and you know how in contact with the feeder and the bites you are. Because if I am catching bream well, Steve, I do like to play them in a positive way as well. Because I think if you sort of do this, pulling the fish, pumping it and stopping, all that encourages the bream to do is to then kick, and you have to stop.
Yeah.
When you really get into that sort of movement of keeping the bream coming, they don't really have much chance to do anything, do they?
No, and that's the way I tend to fish. If I hook a bream, or when I hook a bream, to be more positive, when I've hooked that fish, I like it, once I've got that coming to me, I like to keep it coming to me.
Yeah.
I think the only time that fish is going to come off, if it hasn't got a good hook hold, is when you stop and the fish turns on its side,
yeah.
And then you're pumping, stopping, and if you can just keep that fish coming and keeping it coming to you, there's no reason you can't get a big bream, 4, 5, 6 pound, in 25 seconds, for example.
Yeah, and of course, in a match situation, that's going to mean more fish in the net, and the difference between failure and success, I think.
Well, yeah, because the quicker you get the fish in the net, the quicker you're going to be back out fishing.
Just one final point on how you're fishing the braid, and what I've noticed is, even as the feeder's falling through the water, Steve,
yeah,
you're keeping in contact with it all the time, aren't you?
Yeah, I think it's important to, because you can read things, not necessarily when your feeder's at the bottom, but you can also read whether you're passing through a column of fish. Certainly on Bough Beach, there were areas where probably 2/3 of the way down, you could get an indication, so you knew that there's some fish there, so you knew what you're doing was right to keep that feeder going through the water and keep trying to entice them fish to follow it down and settle on your feed.
It's a really great point, and I suppose it's made even more important when you are fishing in such deep water.
Yes, because you've got that time. In shallow water you don't have that time to see that. So, but on deep waters such as Bough Beach and Ulley, you definitely can pick fish out as you're going through the water if there's definitely fish there, and that can give you pointers on what to do, how to feed it, and maybe change something to catch some of them fish.
Brilliant. Well, looks a bit crazy, but I'm stood out in the lake here at the moment. It's not too far to drop over that ledge. But I thought it just shows perfectly the tips that you're using in the feeder rods today. So I wonder if we could just, I know you've got a fish on.
Yeah, we're good.
If we could just talk about the tips, Steve. So on the 13-foot number 3, you've got the 1.5 ounce carbon tip in. In fact, on all the rods, including the 11-foot, you're using the 1.5 ounce carbon tip.
Yeah,
perhaps that might be interesting for viewers, because I think a lot of time people think they want to fish the most sensitive tip possible when they're bream fishing or feeder fishing.
Well, especially with braid, you see, because braid is so direct, you don't necessarily have to do that. And I like the tips to pull in with the rod. And one of the important things is that when you've got fish in your peg, and you can certainly read your peg better with braid, it's so important not to pick that rod up when you've got fish in your peg without a fish being attached to the hook. And the 1.5 ounce tips on these rods all allow me to do that, to read a line bite from a bream bite, because it's so important that you don't pick that feeder up when there's one there and miss out on catching that.
Yeah, and I suppose another thing as well, because braid is so direct, if you had a very soft tip, most of the tip's going to be bent round anyway.
That's
if there's
right.
any kind of wind or tow,
that's right.
And it's going to render the tip useless. So you do need perhaps a slightly stiffer tip than if you were fishing with mono.
Yeah, that's. I'd go with that. Yeah.
But I've got to thank you because you really helped me design the tips for these rods. And as you say, the fact that we've developed them all to blend perfectly into the carrier section means that you can select the right tip for the right job.
That's right, and having a tip that with that medium action allows me to see what's actually a bite on the hook and what's actually a bite on the line, because it's so important.
Well, Steve, I've had to stop you in mid-action. That long line is producing well, isn't it? You're getting pretty much a bite every cast now. So in a match situation, would you keep fishing that, or would you try your other lines that you fed?
Well, I'm a firm advocate. If you're putting fish in the net to carry on, there's no point changing anything. And I've caught a bream on that line, so the suggestion would be that you're likely you're just going to catch some more. But I'm definitely a firm believer if you're putting a fish in the net, especially in a match situation, because that's the idea of the game, is to keep putting that fish in the net and building your weight.
Well, I don't want to keep you too long, but I wanted to stop you because I want to talk about the feeders that you're using and the rig that you're using. So I've got you to take a selection of feeders out, and you've explained that these pretty much cover the majority of your feeder fishing on lakes.
Yes.
One thing I was going to say was they're all front loaded, aren't they? So they're all like a rocket feeder design.
Yeah, most of the feeders I use these days, especially for fishing, even for fishing 20 metres, I'll use this kind of feeder because it makes it so much easier for casting.
Yeah, it's like a dart, isn't it?
Yes.
It's front loaded.
Yeah.
So it's going to fly true and accurate. And I suppose the other great thing about these over the old style rocket feeders, where you had the lead mounted at the bottom, was the feed can come out very easily.
These are user friendly, quite easy to load into the ground bait. You can sandwich whatever you want to feed there in between the ground bait. Quite simple, but it is important that you have a wide selection of feeders, because they're all these feeders may do the same in principle, but they all can change your peg and do a different thing.
Different venues, different times of the year even.
Plastic feeders like these zipplers, for example, and the cage feeder in the zippler, they're really good. And I think that's a Browning Jet, that one. They're really good at coming up in the water. So if you have got areas where you need to get your feeder up, typically like this today, if that ledge were further out, you may have to use a plastic feeder or a plastic cage. I think this feeder is designed to come up. I think that's called the riser. But cage feeders like this tend to hug the bottom more, because just by virtue of the shape of them.
And the weight, I suppose.
And the weight of them, yeah. Winder feeders, for example, these can be great in the fact that if you switch to a winder feeder mid-match, the tendency for a winder feeder is, if you're fishing at 60 metres, for example, you only have to put maybe 2 or 3 winds on the reel to actually get in contact with so they can be a bit quicker. Another little tip for that is, if you think the fish have backed off slightly, if you put a winder feeder on, not necessarily a big winder feeder and feed it, but a that is more or less like a bomb, but it would class as a feeder. You can actually cast that, and that would probably land 2 or 3 metres past your feed area.
I think that's fascinating. It's something I'd never considered.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't use the window feeders a lot myself, and I think they're very popular at the moment, obviously because they are so easy to cast. And perhaps sometimes people are using them for the wrong reasons. But that is an amazing insight into what you're saying, because even though you're clipped up to the same distance, you're saying a window feeder is going to land further out
100%,
than a normal feeder. Because I suppose just the nature of it, it's almost like a bullet, isn't it?
That's right.
It's going through the water, right on the limit of your clip, and therefore it might only be landing half a metre or a metre further, but that could be the difference between where the fish are feeding and not.
The great thing with that is if it's just a case of casting to the fish, if the fish have backed off, and in days gone by before we had window feeders, if you thought that had happened, you'd have switched over, you'd have probably unclipped and maybe gone 3 or 4 metres further to try and get that. You don't have to do that with a window feeder. You can stay on the same clip, and you can probably go 2, 3, 4 metres past it, just because the window feeder is so direct.
I love it, and that's definitely something I'm going to use and try next time I'm feeder fishing. Right, the rig. You've actually pretty much got the same rig on all your rods for fishing at different ranges, and I think this is really neat as well. It's got to be worth understanding a bit more about this. I can see that you've got a quick chain swivel there trapped between 2 gripper stops.
Yeah.
And you've got a loop here of braid. So just explain a bit about it, Steve, because I think this is a brilliant rig.
Well, in principle, that's a paternoster.
Yeah.
It's just the old style paternoster where in years gone by you would have tied a knot in there and then attached your up length to that tail.
Yeah.
But that in itself had inherent problems where if you got tangled, there were nowhere for the twist to go. It twisted around the feeder. But this rig, because if you look at that quick stop there, it moves so free.
Yeah, so you've got your gripper stops. You've got about a centimetre gap that allows that to freely move.
Yeah, I can split that. Yeah. Basically, what you've got is on this line here, you've got a 6-inch loop with the bottom one sits on a couple of knots there to maintain that as tight as you can. Yeah. And you don't really want that. It could slip down there, but it's locked on the knot. A simple overhand knot on the top, and this second gripper stop just puts down, just barely touches the knot, and then the rig works primarily like a paternoster, but you've also got that anti-tangle helicopter style.
It's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then you've got your quick chain swivel, so you can have different hook lengths. You could have maybe different diameter, different hook sizes, different baits, and it's saving time as well.
The rig can be more versatile in the fact that if you really pull these down, you can turn your rig into more of a bolt rig. Yeah. Yeah. If fixed rigs are allowed, this is my preferred rig. Yeah. And
the great thing about it as well, as you're proving, is even though it's a fixed rig, it is safe.
Yes.
So if a fish was to be tethered, it can pull that gripper stop off and hopefully get away without being tethered to the...
And the important thing is that this second gripper, what just goes down, just sits on the knot there. Yeah. Just sits on the knot on the top, and that would be quite simple. Yeah. If you were to have a crack off and a fish get tethered, that
Steve,
should in theory...
I tell you what, this session is just proving fascinating for me. I've picked up some amazing tips already, and that is definitely a rig I'm going to try. So thanks for that.
No problem, James.
It's learning great. This is a great sneak preview of Steve's side tray with all his ground baits and baits. So if you want to get close in and have a look. Steve, you've got all your hook baits and ground baits really neatly organised here with your sweet mix, fish meal mix, and then all your different hook baits and feeds. And a really great tip that I want to mention is the fact that you've got your chopped worm on a sieve. And what's the reason for doing that?
Well, worms, chopped worms are inherently wet, and it's a great tip I got off my mate Wayne Bartholomew. Started sieving the juice off the worms, and you could control how you got the feed out the feeder. Don't get me wrong, the worm juice is fine used in a certain application, but now I've got down to the bottom of that now, you can see there's quite a lot of juice in it, and I really do need to remove it.
Yeah.
Now, I hate doing this, but I can remove some of the juice out of there, and I know when I feed the worms into, they're not a slop and absolutely stick the ground bait up and make it so that my feeder's not actually delivering it right.
And another thing that I've picked up on, which I think is great, is what you've emphasised there. So every time you fill your feeder up, you're taking the different components that you're feeding and putting it in fresh into the ground bait and then feeding it.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're chopping all your worms up, putting your casters in and whatever. You're actually being very flexible in what you're feeding every time, and it's so fresh, and I think that's a really key thing.
Yeah, I think the thing is the point is you're getting from when you're fishing a peg, and if you've got all that mixed in, and I do see people put everything in the ground bait, well you can't actually regulate your feed like that, can you? So by having it like this, if I think I need to feed some more chopped worms, or I think I need to feed a feeder full of casters, for example, I can do that. Having it all mixed together eliminates that choice.
I think it's brilliant. So just really quickly, let's look at your bait. You've got live red maggots, dead red maggots, red worms, fluoro pinkies, casters, and your chopped worms.
Pretty standard bait tray for this time of year. Maybe in summer, places like Bough Beach, for example, would have pellets and sweet corn, but at this time of year now, I think we'll leave the pellets and sweet corn.
We're on the change a bit, aren't we? We're in autumn,
exactly.
And you're just sort of feeding it with a bit more of a careful approach.
Exactly.
But I love the fact that you've got the flexibility of switching between two different ground baits and different hook baits and feeding regimes.
Yes.
Right then, Steve, I'm now going to quiz you about the ground bait mixes that you're using, because I know people are going to be really interested about that. So perhaps you could just explain.
Well, for my distance line, where I'm targeting the bream and skimmers, I'm using a fish meal based ground bait. Yeah.
It's a very fine mix, isn't it?
It is, yeah. I tend to, at this time of year, keep it really well sieved, and any stuff what I do take out, I'll just put back in the grinder and put it back in after. But that inherently is quite inert, and it just sits there on the bottom.
You're targeting bigger fish.
Targeting bigger fish, yeah. But fish meal in itself tends to be a bigger fish mix.
Have you mixed that with any brown crumb, or is it pretty much pure fish meal ingredients?
It's fish meal ingredients, milled expanders, etc. Fish meal, there's some salmon fry in there as well, just to give it a little bit more of a boost.
And colour's interesting. Do you have any sort of set thinking on colour?
I do, yeah. I do like the olive green type mixes what's available. I really do like that colour. I can remember years ago seeing ground bait when it first came out with green, and I was horrified. But after seeing people catch on it, I do like that olive green colour. Well,
it's certainly proving effective today. Right then, what about your sweeter, more active mix?
Well, yeah, this is a cereal mix which is containing breadcrumbs and biscuit meal, etc. I do like a dark mix. I do, regardless. I just tend to think that that's less exposure for the fish, if you like, where you can put a dark bed on the ground on the lake bed, and the fish will settle on it better. Yeah, the second mix I'm using is a cereal-based mix. This is containing crumbs, cereals, little bits of polenta and stuff like that. This is a mix more targeting the roach and maybe skimmers, etc. But the difference with this mix is it's quite active. What you've got a lot of particles in this, what will float up in the water and attract fish onto it, where as opposed to the fish meal, which is quite inert.
It's a bit coarser, isn't it? And there's definitely, we've seen it in the water when we've been dropping it in the water. There's particles that are fizzing off,
yes,
are lifting up off the bottom, and that's got to be a mix that's going to be attractive for those smaller fish.
in summary, on ground bait, this kind of ground bait, I think the fish can really eat it. Yeah, and the smaller fish will eat it. Where the fish meal ground bait, with it being really fine and the stuff what I'm using there, I think they'll gill feed on this, and they'll spend they'll spend longer in your peg picking this out, and getting the taste of the fish meal, but not actually being able to eat it.
Yeah, I understand, and you emphasise that mix enables you to vary the different feed as well.
Of course it does.
So you can respond to how the fish are feeding.
That's right.
Perhaps rather than giving them a mix that's quite coarse from the beginning.
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant, and that's fascinating to see as well. Thanks a lot.
No problem, James.
Right, Steve, sorry, I'm getting in your way again, but I just want to quiz you on your hooks and hook lengths. And you're just changing, aren't you, to a different one. So what have you got on there?
Well, this one's a 22 10R. I just nicked it into the towel.
Definitely sharp.
Yeah, this one's a 22 10R, size 14, ready tied.
So that's a Gamakatsu, yeah?
Yeah, I've been using these ones as well lately, these natural ones from Preston, and tie these up. A good tip is always have plenty tied up on, but if you're not so good at tying them, these hooks are fantastic. You can get these ready tied.
So you actually use them like that?
I use ready tied hooks. Yeah, I'm quite lazy when it comes to tying hooks when I can.
So just to be clear, you're putting a 14 on and your hook length's 0.16.
Yeah.
I mean, how low would you go on hook length, given that you're fishing the braid straight through?
Or 14 or 12.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's more than strong enough.
Okay. Brilliant.
If you look at an 0.16 there, it's 3 kilos, it's 6.5 pounds.
Yeah.
On an 0.16 on there.
And you do feel it's important to change your hook. If there's any fear of it not being as sharp as it can be, change it, yeah?
The first signs of having an hook what isn't performing right is if you can't put the bait on properly.
Yeah.
That's the first sign, and if you do get that, you need to take the hook off and change it.
So don't be lazy changing the hook.
No.
But you can be lazy buying pre-tied hooks.
Yes.
I like your style, Steve. That suits me.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, I left you in peace, and you've got a good run of bream going now. I think this is your 6th one, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I've learnt so much watching you today, and I hope the viewers have too. So I think we're going to make this the last fish and call it a day.
Thanks for watching.